in this episode of the Carrick Podcast.
I need to be better at that last 20 miles. I need to find a way to be able to stay on top of it for there. It's funny how it kind of comes full circle to a degree with that stuff where I used that as a huge motivational tool. And last fall when I did break the record, when I got to mile 80, I remember when I saw that split, when I hit 80, I thought to myself, I was like, it's been 4 years since that event that I fell apart in the last 20 miles. And now I find myself back in this position where I have an opportunity to not let that happen. So it goes back to like kind of using some of those poor experiences or some experiences that didn't work, or using those low points as a tool or a piece of experience to kind of leverage a better day down the road.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Carrick Podcast. I am your host, current New Jersey Devils defenseman, Carrick. I am very excited about our guest today. Our guest today is Zach Bitter. He is an ultra marathoner. He is the current 100 mile. That is almost 4 consecutive marathons. World record holder in which he ran in 11 hours, 19 minutes, and 13 seconds. He is also the current world record holder in the 12-hour, that was a flat track run at 104.88 miles in 12 hours. That's truly astounding. I'm really excited to share with you his process, how he talks about his relationship with self-reflection, self-talk, how he trains physically, mentally for such a grueling and really unique sport to compete for that period of time is something that as a hockey player is so different from what I do. So let's do this. I'm very excited to talk with him today. He's also the first guest that I don't have a direct relationship with, so kind of trying something new as a podcast host. Grateful that Zach was able to lend us both some of his time today. Let's do this. Zach, I'm super excited to talk to you. You're one of the first guests I'm speaking with, honestly, for the first time. We just met, in the 5-10 minutes we were talking before we started. But take us through, talk to me about sort of your introduction into ultra marathoning. As now being a world record holder in the 100 mile, you've obviously built a really strong career, but it doesn't sound like something you just kind of tread into lightly. You have to decide that you're going to run the distances that you do. And I'm super interested to hear just sort of who steered you that direction, how you ended up in that field.
Yeah, well, first, Connor, thanks for having me on. It's always cool to check out other podcasts and, hear from other athletes too. Especially, I love following my own sport, but I also love following sports that are relatively polar opposite to mine, because then I think there's some interesting congruences even with the differing and stuff, especially coming on the nutrition front. But yeah, I've been probably introduced to running from a very early age. When I was in middle school, we did the Presidential Physical Fitness Challenge stuff, and I kind of found out pretty quick that the mile run was my strength versus the shuttle run or the pull-ups and all that stuff. So that kind of got me a little interested. Being kind of a young kid, you tend to gravitate a little bit more towards what you're good at, I think. And, my parents have always been were really supportive about getting me into a variety of different sports and just kind of feeling out what I liked, what I was good at, what I wasn't so good at, and everything in between. And that kind of led into high school, where I started to kind of take running a little more seriously. Probably my sophomore year, I realized I probably should focus primarily on running versus some of the more team sports, although cross country is a team sport, but it's a pretty big individual effort on your own race. But then probably by my senior year in high school, I started taking it seriously enough to want to kind of train for it year round. And college cross country and track is when I probably really got excited about just understanding why we do certain things. Even my senior year in high school, I trained year round, but I was basically just doing what the coach told me to do and assuming that's what you should be doing. And, thankfully my coach was a big fan of the sport, so he knew what he was talking about. But in college, I got interested in learning that myself. So I understood like, well, this is why we would do, mile repeats one day, or this is why we would do a long run on the weekends and stuff like that. And that really kind of got my interest. And as I looked more and more into the sport and kind of continued to understand where my strengths and weaknesses were within endurance sport, I got a little bit fascinated with this ultra marathon stuff. So after college, when I didn't really have the structure of a team and a coach any longer, I started kind of just gravitating to doing the workouts I liked the most, which tended to be kind of the longer runs. So I went on a bit of an endeavor of just kind of building volume at a relatively low intensity, just to kind of see where my limits were with that. And that led me to my first ultra marathon at the end of 2010, a 50 miler in Wisconsin. I was fortunate enough to have a good enough day that I had a positive experience and win the race. So that kind of got my appetite increased a bit to start. I remember the first time I read about an ultra marathon with any real interest in college, I thought, I'll probably do my first one when I'm like 30 and really just exhaust where my potential is at like 5Ks, 10Ks, marathons, and that sort of stuff first. But when I was 24 and I jumped in that 50 miler, I kind of started steering a little more towards that. And by the end of 2011, I was basically training exclusively for ultra marathon stuff. And then since then, I've just been kind of like continuing to learn the sport, finding out which events, which distances, which terrains, and things that I enjoy the most, and really trying to kind of use myself as a bit of an experiment to some degree in terms of kind of finding where my limitations are. And I really like kind of the process of preparing for a race as much as I do like a great result or a race itself, because you just learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about where your physical strengths and weaknesses are, where you can maybe tweak things to make improvements, what went well, what didn't, and then kind of go back to the drawing board and start building again for another event.
Well, that's part of, you touched on it there where, one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you is you do have this inherent sort of curiosity. You seem to be looking under any stone that you think might improve your performance. And I think, just given the nature of your sport, if you do not love the process, if you're strictly result oriented, there's such a long payoff that you have to wait for your result, that I really respect any endurance athlete, because really in team sport, your passion is our punishment. If we're going for long periods of time, it's because we're getting bag skated. There was a poor effort and that our coach is unhappy with. When did you realize that you could use this curiosity really to your advantage, and what steps have you taken mentally, physically, to really try and, because you try to be the best, right? And anything you try and do, you're not out there. While it is fun, you also race to win. What has been the biggest bang for your buck in terms of what you've began to learn about yourself now from 24 to, you're 33 now, and, kind of at the top of your game? Like, what were some of the big steps that helped you exponentially get to where you are now?
Yeah, I think a few kind of come to mind. One thing I learned about myself is I respond pretty positively to high volume training. So for me, putting in like a 5,000 to 5,500 mile year or averaging around 100 miles per week of running is something that my body tends to respond pretty well to. I didn't get there overnight. I was probably a low volume runner going into college, and that's when I was first introduced to a high volume training strategy. And but since then, have gradually kind of built up to where I can sustain kind of that stuff without doing too much damage. And then it's the next thing within the framework of that is just periodizing my training schedule so that I'm at where I need to be for the race specifically I'm training for. And, folks who do endurance sports will recognize like periodized training scheduling. That's a pretty popular route of preparing, where you're doing, a lot of race specific type stuff close to the event that they're trying to peak for. And that same principle, in my opinion, falls with ultramarathon. It's really skewed from an intensity standpoint to the lower end of the spectrum on race day. So kind of learning kind of the order of operations to ideally get ready. A lot of people come into the sport and they think, okay, I'm running 100 miles or I'm running 50 miles. I'm just gonna go run a lot. And that works to a degree because they are kind of hitting the race specific stuff by doing that. But there is some value, I think, when you're starting to kind of get to your potential to kind of go back to the drawing board and do some of those shorter, faster intervals and some of those lactic threshold, like longer intervals and tempo runs as you lead up to the kind of key session of training where you will really focus in on race day intensity. And There's a lot of benefits from kind of periodizing like that, from just a muscular balance standpoint or running efficiency standpoint, raising kind of the ceiling on your aerobic capacity as well. So, that's something I learned along the way too. It's like, it's not as much as just going out and grinding out 100 plus miles a week every week. You can step back from that a little bit and introduce some intensity earlier in the training plan and work your way to that. And, rather than trying to run the same amount of miles every week, give yourself an opportunity to kind of take a step back and do a little less during parts of the season. But then ultimately, when you're within that window where it's really kind of crunch time, so to speak, that's where you kind of punch the gas a little bit on your overall volume. So, I'll have weeks where I'll hit 150 plus miles, but that's relatively unsustainable year round. So I'll sit on that volume for maybe 3, 4, at most maybe 6 weeks leading into my taper for the event, and then kind of rest up and be ready. And then I'm kind of, I've sharpened the spear, so to speak, to the skill set that I'm going to need on race day about as finely as you can, without maybe overreaching so much that you show up on the starting line injured or a little burnt out.
Yeah, I've done that. I, even in our own training, so as a team sport athlete and as a hockey player, you play, 82 games a year, and prior to that, you have a month-long training camp, and hopefully after that, you can play up to 28 more hockey games, with 7-game series, 4 rounds of playoffs all the way to the Stanley Cup final, and that's been something. I'm 26 now, kind of entering my physical prime, for hockey. Is I've tried to do a better job of making my highs high in terms of intensity in my own training, whether I get to like a 9, 10, or even 11 out of 10, really flooring it on the days where I am. And then throttling down, instead of training in like that 7 out of 10 difficulty, I'll drop down even like the 5, 6, or even sort of a 4 out of a 10 day, more mobility work, longer, lower heart rate, just kind of to get some blood flow and get the tissue healthy to train really explosively again. But it's definitely something that, like, earlier in my career, I would just kind of out of nerves and wanting to get ready for the test. Like, I would totally stack August with all sorts of volume. I would just still be jamming in the gym. My ice time would be up, to an hour or 2 a day. And I showed up, I think there was one year as a Washington Capital in particular, I had stayed there in the summer, and I showed up really flat. I was doing like 2-a-day workouts 4 or 5 days a week, where I would train mostly weights in the morning and then, run in the evening. It was just too much volume. And so you clearly have this awesome process that you've refined, over time. But I want to know, like, specifically the night before a big race, like, what is your self-talk like? What is your process, even into what you eat? Because as a player, you're really only worked up for like your first day of training camp, your first real preseason game, your first, regular season game. And then after that, they progressively start to feel more similar. And you get up for, there's like an extra, bit of butterflies, maybe for a really good opponent, an old team. I've been traded a couple times. But after that, you're pretty consistent day in, day out as a pro hockey player. And that's really the skill set, right? You're trying to show up as the same player every day. The coach needs to know, what they're getting as an asset out of me. But what is, when you are worked up, if you still get worked up, what is that night before sort of process?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that's where our sports maybe diverge a little bit, where you kind of have so many repetitions of game day that you can kind of normalize that experience or get a little bit of muscle memory, so to speak, with it. Whereas with ultra marathons, a pretty heavy racing season for me is going to be like 6, maybe 8 events, and I'm probably only peaking for maybe 2 or 3 of those. So it can be a little bit of a difference in the sense that you're going to have a little bit of that anxiety, and I think that makes sense when you spend months preparing for a single event, and then you get closer to it and you realize you put a bunch of work and a bunch of attention and all that stuff into it. You want to make it bear some fruit. So I think just like, one thing I do like to do is, like, when I do have other events that maybe aren't my peak race, just kind of do those as like dress rehearsals, as like, okay, what do I do the day before? What do I do the morning of? What's my best strategy for fueling during the race and things like that, and give myself a little bit of opportunities for that. I'll also use my long runs on the weekends to kind of practice as a little bit of a dress rehearsal type thing, to try to simulate race day a bit, so I have a little more of that kind of intuitive nature like you have going into kind of those mid-season games, I'm sure. For me though, nutritionally, I follow a high-fat, low-carb diet, which is where we probably merge quite a bit from a nutritional standpoint. And what that means for me as an endurance athlete who is sometimes burning 2 to 3 times my resting metabolic rate is I'm always kind of consuming fat as my primary macronutrient. And then it just depends on like how much carbohydrate I'm going to kind of flex in throughout the course. And during like certain phases of my training where I'm basically off season or low structured, I'll go down to like almost a classic ketogenic framework. And then when I get into the peak training where I may be hitting those 150-mile training weeks, I won't be afraid to flex my carbs up a little higher, around maybe 20% of my intake. So when I get to the point where it's time to go for a race, I'm probably 1 or maybe even 2 weeks into a taper. So my volume and intensity has settled down quite a bit compared to those peak weeks. So my energy output has also, certainly on the intensity side of things, and I just don't have a huge need for a fast-acting fuel source like a carbohydrate during those kind of couple weeks leading into the race. So I actually start planning on race day nutrition kind of already at that point, and I'll go very low carb for a week or two leading up to the couple nights before the race itself. So if I have a race on, say, Saturday morning, Thursday evening, I might start to reintroduce some carbohydrates the way I would during peak training, just to try to top off my muscle and liver glycogen a little bit going into the race. And then morning of, since the race itself is so low intensity in most cases, I'll have a fatty protein-based breakfast. I'll try to stay away from carbohydrates for the most part before the start of the event because I want to kind of leverage the overnight fast. And then starting burning a high level of fat at the beginning so that I kind of defending my liver and muscle glycogen throughout the course of the event versus kind of spiking that process by, taking in a high carb breakfast or taking like a gel or like a fuel source thing like at the start line like you see in some cases. So going into the race, I'm at least the hours before I'm staying really low carb. And then once I'm maybe 30, 45 minutes into the event, I'll start kind of fueling the way I would during the race itself. And I'm usually targeting for peak races around 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour. On some of the like kind of lower level races where they're just training races or structured long runs, I'll go as low as maybe 20 grams an hour. And it's the way I like to describe it is, even at my leanest, the leanest endurance athletes on the planet have enough body fat that a fuel tank is unexhaustible during an event. So I don't have to really worry about fat oxidation from a consumption standpoint on race day. Muscle and liver glycogen are the ones you can potentially deplete, even at these lower intensity events. So all day, I'm basically out there running with one of my fueling goals is to defend liver and muscle glycogen. So one of the ways to kind of do that is to kind of like, even if I'm super fat adapted, there's going to be points in even a long race where my intensity is high enough where I'm tapping into that liver and muscle glycogen even without eating carbohydrates. So I will gradually deplete that source by the end of the race if I don't defend it a little bit. So bringing in a little bit of exogenous carbohydrate sources during the event, I find is kind of helps with my performance a little bit. And that's where I kind of come into that maybe 40 grams per hour or so of, I'm using a product right now called, by a company called S Fuels called Race Plus. And I like their stuff because they're kind of, their foundation stuff is high fat, low carb. And they work with a guy out in New Zealand who'd be an interesting guy to talk to probably down the road for you if you want, is Dr. Dan Plews. He's an Ironman age group world champion and a PhD in exercise phys and nutrition out in New Zealand, Auckland. And he's really come up with a lot of good research and a lot of good kind of pointers for endurance athletes, especially extreme endurance athletes who are kind of have a foundation in high fat, low carb, but also recognize that a little bit of carbohydrate can go a long ways for someone with that kind of a nutritional approach on race day.
Yeah, I think, the pro sport of hockey was a little bit behind on, the physical development side really up until maybe 10, 15 years ago. And then, the strength coach got really popular in hockey. Players really started to weight train and bike and run and develop, sort of a more well-rounded sense as an athlete. And I think sort of the next wave, is occurring right now, which is like the skill coach acquisition. Similar to football, you look at football, there's 200 coaches on the sidelines. There's a quarterback coach, there's a lineman coach, there's this coach, there's that coach. And players, started to begin to like individually consult just a little bit outside their team, to continue to build like player identity and that kind of thing. And that's going on right now. And I think a little bit of the next wave, and I know just for myself and some other teammates, there's been a little bit more focus on nutrition and like functional medicine doctors guys are using because, it's so difficult. Hockey, guys used to kind of rely on their skill. You'd play the game, guys would have, 3-4 beers on the bus, eat whatever was on the plane, and then, go out and play the next one. And just like that, the easiest way to play poorly is to be injured or to feel crappy or sick. And so I think now players are realizing you can't build career years over one night. You need to always be making these sort of deposits of these investments in your health. And it's something that I took on when I was lucky to play as a Toronto Maple Leaf. It was kind of like a mecca of sort for alternative medicine. I met a couple different functional medicine doctors that I really liked. And I did I think it's called Nutrients was the profile. It was sort of like a DNA spit test. I did that alongside like a Nutrival, which did more, I think that tested more for like minerality, amino acid profile inside my body, trying to see any overgrowth in the gut and things like that. And these are all developing sciences, but it was really interesting. The Nutrients, I had a phone call with Dr. Mansour Mohammed. I did where he explained to me without ever meeting me, like insanely intimate knowledge about the ongoings of my body. And it was so cool. He was originally the one that directed me towards sort of like a cyclical ketogenic diet. So sometimes in season, most practice days and I've been around long enough where I kind of know, okay, today's going to be a lighter day. Today's going to be a heavier day. And I'm not as fat adapted as you are. I haven't had the years of experience yet. And I think there's just still a little bit less control, just given like our travel schedule and that over meals. But I've tried to use like 25 to 35 grams of carb on most practice days, like 108 to 190 grams of protein. My protein's pretty high still, just given my body weight. And then I think it was like 190. I got to look at the sheet again. I got it all written down. But honestly, when I stick to it, and then I would sort of supplement with carbohydrate pre-game, I would use a little bit of sweet potato for lunch and things like that. And post-game if I was playing a lot. And I really like this because what I found was, as a player, I'm a little bit more of a depth player. I'm not a defenseman playing, crazy minutes every single night. Honestly, my mental acuity was like more important than like maybe how my jump felt, how I felt physically sometimes with the carbohydrate. When my carb intake was really high, I would feel super sluggish, just because of the chronic travel. And I'm interested to see, I think, a lot of the superstars are setting the tone. They, have more income. They have more resources available to them where they're really trying to invest in their body. And it's kind of been with the organizations I've been around, the better players sort of dictate culturally what the organization has to offer in terms of like daily supplements available and things like that. But I think hockey in the next really even 3 to 5 years is really going to revolutionize just on the nutrition and training side with all the sports science development to try and keep guys fresh. Because it's too long a season. You can't just guess and check your way around. You're going to be wrong. It's too valuable. The NHL is too tight. There's too much parity, to leave it to chance.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to follow sports like hockey and National Basketball Association for that very reason, where it's such a grueling season, and you have these weird times of games. I'm sure where you might have nights where it's like you can't control when you go to bed, or you can't control like when you have to wake up in the morning, and yeah. So I think at that point you almost have to try to dial in the things you can control to as much of a degree as you can, and then recovery's got to be such a huge kind of a piece to that puzzle for you too when you're in the season and you want to be feeling consistent from one game to the next. And I think that's maybe where you're probably heading in a good direction too, because I know when I switched to a high-fat, low-carb diet, one of the reasons I did it is because I felt like I was a little more on a roller coaster ride over the course of the day, where you feel great for a couple hours and you feel like you can take a nap, and then you feel great for a couple hours and you feel like you take a nap. And like it's hard to time that if you have a game at 7 p.m. and you hit that roller coaster at the wrong time, and then that can cost you the game versus have a really good day. So I think I really like kind of the more like kind of steady, like even lined energy output I have following a more of a high fat, low carb approach.
Yeah, I mean, the recovery is huge. And I'd say that's where, it's a little bit of what I'm doing with this podcast. There's really sort of like 3 groups of listeners that I really try to, speak with is one, I get a lot of questions from young players about, what's your pregame meal or what's your pregame, self-talk, right? And I engage in that conversation. I get a lot of discussion with like 20 somethings trying to do something, kids my age out of school, trying to take the next step professionally or with their own health. And then sort of heads of household, moms, dads, asking for, little Jimmy, how they can help them, their son or daughter play at a higher level as a student athlete. And that's somewhere I've began to shift the conversation is, I think as athletes, we see it, right? Like we see like the pre-race pump up, the pre-game, the player walks in with their Beats headphones off the bus and there's sort of the visualization practice. And these things are kind of inherent and they're taught at a young age. But one of the things that's really helped me maintain consistency is having a post-game sort of process. I used to often be a player that we'd play at 7, the game gets over 9, 10, whatever, you get back to the hotel or, on the plane at 11. And, there's a lot of nights where if there's travel, you're not hitting the sheets until 2 a.m., and if you played poorly, if you want to obsess over a mistake or things like that, mentally, have the hamster upstairs running all night, you can be up. I mean, I've done it where I've been up till 4, 5, 6, even 7 a.m. with a meeting at 11 the next day for the next game. So for me, my process is often like, no matter what now, when I get in a hotel, I'll kind of take like a cool shower, try and bring my temperature down, usually just from flying and, the EMF and all that, the bad light. You're usually a little stirred up still. We use a lot of caffeine is used in NHL locker rooms pre-match. So you see guys slamming espressos at 6:30 p.m., trying to get their resting heart rate up to like $130. So I've totally cemented like my post-game routine. Cool shower. I'll usually do like a headspace or like a breathing technique of some sort. The box breathing's great. If I'm up for something a little bit more intense, I'll use some of the Wim Hof protocol. And then that sort of brings me down into being able to rest. And it's like, if I could walk in the hotel room and fall asleep right away, that's what I do. But I'd rather sort of invest my baseline, my routine to get my body ready for sleep. That's kind of my post-game routine. But what recovery, tools is common, for you in running, just because I feel like you would have a better experience with like chronic injury or more overuse, more just given the repetitive nature of the sport. I'm so interested to hear like kind of your tricks of the trade.
Yeah. I think like the overuse repetitive injury thing is probably the big one. And then when you get when you get into the actual different kind of disciplines within the sport of ultramarathon, you have like such a wide range of kind of like mountain athletes versus kind of more runnable trail and then road and track and that sort of stuff. And for me, I've kind of skewed a little more towards the flat runnable stuff. So that just opens up probably an even bigger door for potential overuse because you're just kind of going through a little more of a similar mechanic over and over again than you would be if you're running over the kind of undulating terrain on a trail on a regular basis or exclusively in some cases. So I like to focus on things to kind of prevent the imbalances. So I'll do a strength training program that I like to kind of keep myself from getting maybe like quad dominant or deactivating my glute muscles and things like that. So, it's not anything that's super spectacular on paper. It's basically your basics, like your squats, deadlifts, some kettlebell swing type stuff. I'll do some like core, resisted core work and things like that from strength training. And I do think that helps kind of keep me from having certain parts of my body underdeveloped and others overdeveloped to the point where it puts too much stress on one spot. And I've had some lower leg kind of overuse injuries really early in my career. I lost a season, an indoor and outdoor track season in college due to some Achilles tendon stuff. And then I've had some IT band stuff in the past. But since ultra running, I haven't had as much of that. I've had only one injury that really even sidelined me for any meaningful races. So that's something I've just been kind of fortunate with, I guess. But also with the recovery side of things, I think it is also like one big one that I think a lot of times gets overlooked is sleep. That's another reason that kind of drew me to the high fat, low carb diet was my sleep had historically been really well. I was a great sleeper in high school. I could go to bed, wake up 8-9 hours later, and then be good to go until bedtime. And in college, for the most case, I kind of continued that trend. But somewhere along the line between then and starting ultra marathon running, I would, wake up multiple times a night. And I noticed that was just not only inconvenient from a time standpoint, and at that time I was also a full-time teacher, so losing an hour or two of productivity to try to sleep more because I couldn't stay asleep was just not really a good solution, given
Right.
some 20-hour training weeks in the midst of a full-time job and that sort of stuff. So that's one thing I really tried to kind of be a little more conscious of. And the start to that was like just switching diet up, and that seemed to help quite a bit. I started sleeping consistently through the night again, and then kind of some similar stuff like that which you talked about, where trying to avoid blue light at like later hours of the day, not staring at the phone while I'm in bed trying to fall asleep, trying to eat dinner a couple hours before bedtime so I'm not trying to digest a full meal as I'm trying to fall asleep at the same time. Temperature regulation is a great one too, and that's a tough one here in Phoenix sometimes.
Yeah.
You just watch that energy bill go up if you turn the air on too high, but it's probably worth cooling off a bit to try to get some good sleep in the long run. But yeah, I mean, those are kind of the key ones. And then kind of like I said in the beginning too, I think not getting too one-dimensional with my training or too fixated on just doing a lot of long, slow miles all the time. Because, that's going to put you in a position to overdevelop in some areas, underdevelop in others, and then just get that chronic overuse stuff. So kind of, being cautious when I get into the short interval stuff, because, that stuff is a little more abusive on your body in the acute fashion. So you definitely want to start slow. And I definitely do. Like when I start doing high intensity stuff, I might spend a couple weeks where I'm just doing like some short strides or like really short intervals, but not too many of them. And then I start kind of really targeting like VO2 max type workouts where I'm doing 3-minute intervals, basically at all out intensity for those 3 minutes. But the first week I might only do a 3x3 on that, just to kind of let my body adjust and feel out kind of how I'm going to respond to that type of an intensity. And then over time kind of build up volume at that intensity week in and week out for a few weeks before moving on to a different system of training. And I really do think that kind of hitting all those systems are really beneficial to like your health and like kind of longevity from an injury standpoint, and just keeping things more balanced and less kind of one-dimensional.
Yeah, I agree. It's been something that, in hockey, for example, the sport has become so 24/7, 365. It's become highly specialized. There's like these hockey schools for kids, which are like, specialized prep schools where the kids don't even go to a classroom anymore. They take a couple classes at the rink and then they skate in the morning, they skate in the afternoon. Our sort of issue in hockey is more so hips and shoulders. Shoulders from contact, but hips just from trying to balance on, a thin piece of steel on ice all the time. And that's something that, in terms of recovery, that is kind of that is proactively how I try and go about it in season, is just trying to maintain strength and general athleticism so that I'm arriving at the time of competition a more ready and resilient athlete. And that kind of lessens the load on the recovery side. The blue light one is huge. It is funny. I didn't even remember when I first went low carb. My wife and I talked about it, where I used to like sweat the bed heavily when I was eating a higher carb diet. I would wake up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom multiple times. And it was something that like over the course of a couple months, as I got more and more low carb, more and more higher fat, it was something that I didn't even realize was kind of like an ancillary benefit. Wow, I'm sleeping really well. I'm sleeping consistently. And again, going back to the concept of control, like there are going to be nights where your sleep is beyond your control as an athlete that travels. So, you got to be able to make those deposits, when you can. One of the things that I think I've really worked on in my personal life is the way I grew up was, the conversation around getting better was never be satisfied. Never be satisfied. It can always be better. And I think that gifted me sort of a curiosity to see, where I could always be better and a strong sense of self-reflection. I always knew what my strengths were. I always knew my weaknesses were. And I was always trying to play to one and work on the other. But what is sort of your self-talk from the first step of the race all the way through the end? Because, what I found is sort of that never be satisfied mentality can be abrasive. It was a little hot sometimes to deal with. And it can be discouraging when you hear that voice enough. So in terms of, I'm always interested in any sport where there's a lot of solitude, like swimming, running. What is the sort of ongoing conversation in your head? Because your sport is so, while physical, is extremely mental.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think you're spot on with just like I think you want to be critical of yourself because that's how you recognize mistakes and you recognize weaknesses and open your mind to like making changes when things aren't working. But that can be abuses if you're just constantly beating yourself up mentally and physically and only focusing on the negative. So, I mean, this is a part of, I think, sport, and it's certainly the sport I do where a little bit of balance is good too, where you kind of, if you find yourself fixating on the weaknesses or the things you don't think you can do or you're doing wrong, also make sure you're thinking of, okay, well, what also went well? What benefits did I draw from this too? So you kind of still have that positive outlook kind of to pair with the motivation to get better. And during the race, it gets really interesting to me because you're right. I mean, it's definitely physically demanding to run 100 miles, but it's really it really kind of ebbs and flows a little bit because early on in those races, the physical demand is quite low relative to what we can sustain because we have to pace ourselves to be able to push hard on kind of the back third of a 100-mile race. And the thing I find interesting about that is you can kind of work yourself up into a bit of a frenzy while you're trying to be patient early on. So, those early miles that can be a little less physically demanding allows your mind to kind of like ask a lot of questions. So you can find yourself 10 miles into a 100-miler thinking like, getting a little overwhelmed maybe about, oh, I've got to go 90 more miles, or how am I going to get myself to that last aid station or to that last mile? And you really have to kind of discipline yourself not to think about that. So for me, I'm always kind of pre-planning like different little benchmarks along the way that I can kind of hyper focus on during the event. So I'm not thinking of too big of a process at any one time. And, that might be if I'm out on a trail race, it might be aid station to aid station, where my first goal is just to get to that first aid station. I'm going to make sure I'm running within myself so my intensity isn't too high that it will cost me time at the end of the race. But it'll also give me something that's a little more achievable from wrapping my head around to get to that spot. And then, you get to that one and then you can move on to the next aid station. So it's a little more kind of built in with some of the trail races. With some of the track timed event stuff, it gets a little more interesting because you're on maybe like a 400-meter loop like I've done in the past, and then you've seen the entire course after like less than 2 minutes. So then you have to get kind of creative and imaginative about like what you do. And for me, when I'm doing my long runs on those tracks, I try to practice like just getting myself into, I guess, what you maybe call like a flow state, or a little bit more of a kind of a meditative state or daydreaming, whatever you want to kind of label it, where I'm consciously trying to separate myself from the environment I'm in and pretend I'm somewhere else. And sometimes that can just be going in with a lot of different kind of visual cues that put you out somewhere else in your mind. The hard part about that is you also have to make sure you're hitting your splits. So when I do these track events, I can see my pace every lap if I want. So getting really in tune with like your perceived intensity so that you don't have to be just spot checking every lap is ideal for me. So like what I'll do is I'll spend a few laps early in the race kind of dialing in the effort within the range of time I'm trying to look for each lap. And once I kind of dial that in, then I'll start going into that kind of state where I'm kind of removing myself from the environment. And I'll do that for a while, and then I'll spot check every once in a while. Or if I have a crew out there, I'll have them kind of let me know if I'm falling off pace so I can kind of recalibrate. But yeah, those are kind of like my tricks for the mental side of things. And then I think the one thing that I really like that's worked well for me, especially in the last year or so, is when I'm doing my long runs, just really making those kind of a priority to visualize myself at that point in the race. So if I'm doing like a 30-mile long run on a Saturday morning, I'm going into that workout thinking, okay, when I start this, pretend I'm at mile 70 of a 100-miler, and let's just walk through that. Mm-hmm. And what I find is the more I do that kind of visualization process and training, the easier it gets to execute in that part of the race. So the best example I probably have was last year in August at the Pettit Center when I broke the world record for 100 miles in 12 hours. When I got to around like 68, 70 miles, my mind just clicked right away. Oh, this is just one more long run now. And I was no longer thinking about breaking the 100-mile world record or the 12-hour world record, or that I was going to run 100 miles plus that day. I was thinking about just doing one more long run, which I had done, 8, 9, 10 of in the weeks leading up to that. So to me, that really kind of normalized a part of the race that could have been a very big, and in the past had been a very big mental hurdle to kind of get over. So I think that side of this, that just really highlights the mental side of the sport. it feels like it's intense and it's really hard on your body at the end, but in reality, the intensity is still very low, sometimes even lower because you're slowing down a bit. But I think if you can really harness that mental strength and learn what's going to work for you to keep you motivated, that's what's going to kind of really get you your best days.
Yeah, the visualization I find is huge. It's been something I've used a ton earlier in my career, and I've really done a better job bringing it back. There was a period there where I wanted to challenge myself and see if I could just go out there and play. There are players in the NHL that kind of have this laissez-faire. They just show up and their talent, comes out of them. And I wanted to see if I could be that player, and I kind of wasn't. There are certain words that I kind of use to myself. I try to have like a hunter's mentality, where I'm always hunting the play. One of the things I use to myself is do the work early. So as a defenseman, so much of the NHL is you have to there is no getting into the right spot. Mm-hmm. You are either already in the right spot, or if there's any extra effort to readjust your skating or your pace of play, the play is going to be coming down your throat, too quickly. So kind of having those triggers, to reset yourself mid-competition or even mid-shift has been a big help. I've been trying to, even in my own training now, just because usually, we are on quarantine, I'm kind of hanging out at home. I live in Chicago. Usually I kind of have like a space, right? So I jump in my car, I have a 20-minute ride to the rink, kind of have my music or a podcast, listen to, to get in the zone a bit. And now I just have like 4 or 5 steps to my upstairs rooftop, or I go out, on the cement outside and train. So one of the things I've been trying to use is like almost like an alter ego, where it's like, okay, home Connor, like family Connor, it's time to sit down for a bit. Like it's the athletic side, the B side is going to come out and show its face for a bit. And I found that to be, really helpful. And, I did have, maybe this is a little petty, but in my career, I am someone that'll chirp a bit, like, try and get under other players' skin, try and bother people, say things, that'll irritate them or things like that. I don't know if I have a face sometimes that people want to hit, but it seems I can be decent at it. Like, I know this is petty, but like, are you trying to run your own race, or is there ever like trash talk in ultramarathoning? I know it's a crazy question, but like, do you talk shit, on lap 2,655 to your competitor?
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of an interesting thing, because you get like the kind of the cultures around certain sports that kind of either favor or don't favor that a bit. So I get it with hockey. I think the culture of hockey has definitely kind of grown up with that, where it's not real. No one's going home offended by it because everyone's coming in expecting it to happen. It's kind of part of the game. Whereas ultra running kind of, at least in the United States, I think it probably varies across the globe a bit, but in the US, like ultra running has seen like kind of these peaks and valleys throughout its kind of conception, and you get phases where it got really popular for a bit, and then it would tame down and no one even knew what it was other than a handful of people who were doing it. And we're kind of at a point right now where we're in a big upsurge again, where we're getting a lot more people participating. Events are like, just popping up everywhere. So but when it kind of had its most recent resurgence, it kind of had a little bit of a grassroots thing where like it was just a bunch of people showing up on a trail one morning, kind of going, and we're going to run all day and then we're going to drink some beers, that kind of mentality. Yeah. So I think it kind of it developed, at least on the trail side of things in the United States, as like this, a little more of a like just run and then talk after kind of a thing. So you don't see a whole lot of that in the sport. You'll see a little bit here and there. Kind of it's basically all joking for the most part. But and then you get people talking now that it is like there is enough people interested in it, both at the participatory level and well as just watching and following a sport, where you'll see things get said but amongst the folks competing, it's not really something that I see too often. And I don't know if that's just because of the relative low intensity. I think when you have sports like yours, where it's like, it's literally dangerous to be skating full speed and potentially running into someone. So like if you can get into someone's head a little bit, or when you're lining up like a slap shot or something like that, if you can get in someone's head and have just a little voice in there, I could see that being like a pretty big competitive advantage when it works. So but yeah, with ultra running, I think like a lot of folks it's kind of changed a little bit. A lot of folks kind of are still trying to run their race, because most people who've done it for a while know if they get out ahead of themselves, they're going to pay twofold at the end. So like if I go out too fast trying to follow someone who set a blazing pace, and I make up 10 minutes in the first 20 miles, I might give back 20, 30 minutes in the last 10 miles if I had ran more patient, and then run a slower overall time than I would have if I had just done what I know. So usually what I do is when I go in, I kind of have like an upper limit of this is how much I will tease if I feel I need to kind of keep someone in touch. If it's a race where it's a lot of competition, and if someone decides to be really bold and take off much faster than where I drew that line, I let them go and just say, okay, well, either they're gonna have a great day and I wouldn't have beat them anyway, or they're gonna come back and they're gonna look like they're not having much fun in the last 20%, and I'm gonna have a blast because
I'll find you.
Yeah. So I mean, there is a little bit of that too. And you kind of learn that, and it's tough too, because the sport's gotten competitive now too, especially at some of the shorter ultra distances of like 50K to 80K, where people are testing the limits of what's possible. So if someone gets off hot off the starting line, and you can look and say, oh yeah, they're like well ahead of course record pace, there's no way they're going to sustain that. And then every once in a while someone does. We redefine what's possible on a specific course or a specific event distance, and I think that's kind of cool too. You see some growth in that, and you also see a lot of folks. You see a little more in some of these competitive races where you have a group of say 10 guys or 10 gals going out at a pace that's a little bit outside everyone's comfort zone. And the majority of those folks are going to blow up and have a bad day. One or two of them are going to hang on and just like have the race of their life and break the course record or something like that. And I think that's kind of cool from the standpoint of moving the sport forward in terms of trying to find out kind of like, well, what's the human body possible in this particular event? Where's the intensity threshold where you can't go past? And I think we've learned a lot about that in the last decade or so in the sport from when I started doing it to now. And I think that's kind of an exciting time to be in a sport when it's kind of growing to that degree.
Yeah, I was going to guess that. Like, if you got to have a certain, common respect, for the man or woman lining up next to you when, you're all volunteering to go run 100 miles that day, just in terms of the, personal fortitude, amongst the competitors. Like, even in the NHL, there's definitely a lot less chirping at the National Hockey League level just because of the respect for really everyone that's in the league. It's such a hard league to get into, but like in the American Hockey League, like our minor league system and things like that, it's a total jungle down there. Like, guys are getting after each other, shift in, shift out. What is that like when you're running a race and you do feel it start to crumble? Like, what is in your running career, your personal high? And what does that feel like when you're just, you're hitting your stride, you're in that last, like you said, 30 miles and sweet spot. It's just like you got the nitrous or need for speed, back in the day. Or on the other side, what's that feel like when it's crumbling and you overestimate your abilities that day?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I've had so many experiences like that too, and it's easy, especially for me right now, because last year was by far my best year of competition, and so I had a lot of positive ways. I had a lot of those experiences where I felt like I had the gas in the tank to really have a solid day and feel good about it, and not have a whole lot to nitpick. But I've had it on the other end, and it's I did a race. I've had some where it's ended really badly, where I drop out at 60 miles of a 100-mile race because I just didn't have it that day, or I tried to stick to a game plan that wasn't appropriate for the particular environment that I ended up being in, and ended up paying for it. The one that kind of sticks out in my head, it wasn't a bad day by any stretch of the imagination, but I felt like I kind of left an opportunity on the table. Was in 2015, I was targeting the world record for 100 miles at an event here in Phoenix called the Desert Solstice Track Invitational. And I was on world record pace all day through 80 miles. And at the time, before I broke the world record last year, the average pace for the 100-mile world record was about 6 minutes and 52 seconds per mile. And I got to mile 80 needing to average 7. So I was a little bit ahead even. Mm-hmm. But when I got to 80, it was like I had started racking up a bunch of 7.5-minute miles, and I just couldn't quite put the pedal down to get back on pace. And I slowly kind of slipped off world record pace and ultimately ran 11 hours, 40 minutes and broke the American record for 100 miles. But I kind of knew in the back of my mind, like, I need to be better at that last 20 miles. I need to find a way to be able to stay on top of it for there. And, that's probably equal parts mental and physical. It's funny how it kind of comes full circle to a degree with that stuff where I used that as a huge motivational tool. And last fall when I did break the record, when I got to mile 80, I remember when I saw that split, when I hit 80, I thought to myself, I was like, it's been 4 years since that event that I fell apart in the last 20 miles. And now I find myself back in this position where I have an opportunity to not let that happen. So it goes back to like kind of using some of those poor experiences or some experiences that didn't work, or using those low points as a tool or a piece of experience to kind of leverage a better day down the road. And fortunately for me, I've been able to kind of have a race where I can look back and say, yeah, maybe things didn't go perfect before leading up to this, but I definitely needed those experiences to get the experience I ended up having.
That's awesome. Where is, I know you were saying you do a lot of the track style, the flat style runs now, but you have to have been in some pretty cool runs in the world, and seen some pretty beautiful terrain. What's one of your favorite runs you've ever had, just in terms of the scenic view that you were able to take part in?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I've raced around the world a bit. I've done the Gobi 100K in China. I've done the Comrades Ultra Marathon in South Africa. I've raced in Winschoten, Netherlands for World 100Ks, Doha for World 100Ks, and Spain for World 100Ks. And so I've gotten to see some cool spots. There's a race called the Tarawera 102 kilometer over in New Zealand, and that's where my wife and I went for our honeymoon. So I've been to that event, and it's pretty beautiful. In stateside too, like San Diego 100, I really like some of the views you get on the Pacific Crest Trail section of that course. There's races that are way more scenic than ones I've been to too. My wife's done this race out in Europe called Ultra Trail Mont Blanc, and it goes up into the Alps, and you just get some of the best views you can imagine. And so there's a lot of kind of cool opportunities with that. So I'm hoping to even improve my scenic experience going forward a bit.
Yeah, I remember, with the hockey rink, we don't get too many opportunities. Most of the rinks look the same. I mean, some of the in-game, atmospheres in that, like that's kind of our carrot, right? Certain rinks are, super hyped up, and the in-game experience is super cool. Like, for example, playing in Vegas is bananas. Like just how loud the warm-up is. It's like a DJ mix. The place is just on fire when you're walking out for warm up. You're resting hard. You're sitting there just like standing at the blue line waiting to take warm up shots. And you're like, throbbing with the bass of the arena and that. But there was one international tournament. I was playing for the U.S. development team. We were over in Switzerland, and it was pretty cool. Like the walls on the rink were like 3/4 of the way up, and then the last quarter was just open. And then it like connected to the ceiling somehow, and you just saw out on the Swiss Alps, like you saw the mountains during the game. And the tournament was a little light, like we were winning, pretty big every game. So it was this super cool, fun experience. It had this turf soccer field in the back of the rink where we, guys kind of left their warm up and just decided to play a big soccer game before the game. It was one of my, personal favorite memories. But Zach, I wanted to, one of the other things I'm really impressed, with you. Obviously, your sport is incredible. I'm an amateur fan. I think it's super cool. I wouldn't recognize a lot of the big names in the sport, but it's definitely something that endurance sport is something I try to learn from, and I definitely have learned a lot from you today. Just your sense of process is really admirable. But you also, I understand you're doing a charity run soon, which is part of the timing in which we wanted to bring some more attention, where you're doing a 12-hour treadmill run. Talk about, what, charity you'll be serving, and kind of the dynamics of the run and how people can support you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things with all the COVID-19 stuff is, as you can imagine, events have all basically been canceled, seasons have been canceled, and that sort of stuff. So, athletes like ourselves are kind of left with, plenty of probably training opportunities, maybe a little different than what was normal, but not a whole lot of outlets for it. So I started kind of thinking, when it became clear there wouldn't be any racing for at least the first half of the year, like, how do I want to kind of express my energies from the training I'm going to be doing? And I had met a guy named Justin Wren a while back, and he has a charity called Fight for the Forgotten that started when he decided to raise money and volunteer over in the Congo to build wells for the Pygmy tribe. And he's since grown that organization to the point where now they build farms over there as well. But he had identified the Pygmy tribe as like the most forgotten people on the planet, and he wanted to kind of start there. And since then, he's kind of continued to grow the organization to where now they're kind of developing some curriculum for mostly middle and high school schools around the country to kind of combat or just put an educational component around like bullying prevention and things like that. So he's just got a lot of cool things in the works, and he's a really ambitious guy who has a lot of compassion, I think, for other people. So I was thrilled to be able to get into contact with him and help him out a little bit. And I really started getting to know him a little better when I decided to do a project that I'll be doing next year, actually, where I'm going to run from San Francisco to New York, called a transcontinental run of about 3,100 miles. And I wanted to do it to raise awareness and funds for his charity there. So with the connection I had with him there, when I decided to do a 12-hour treadmill or go after the 12-hour treadmill record, I thought, let's make this more than just, me hopping on a treadmill and documenting it. Let's live stream it. Let's bring in guest speakers. Let's bring in some hosts to kind of come in virtually and comment on what's happening, talk about their stories and their sort of stuff. And then as we bring in people to kind of watch that and get entertained by that, I'll be the most boring aspect of the production. I think being on the treadmill, the guest speakers are going to be great, and they're going to, I think, entertain a lot of people. And I thought let's put a donation link to his charity there and make this about raising awareness and funds for his cause. So if people are interested in kind of following along on that, my YouTube channel is where we're going to live stream it. And if people are interested in participating virtually, we actually have 250 slots open for people to join in on the video through Zoom. So if you sign up on sfuelsgolonger.com, they've got a sign up sheet there, and you can sign up to run for part of the day and kind of virtually hang out with me for a bit while I'm trying to see what I can do for 12 hours on the treadmill.
It's unreal. I really appreciate, your sense of service, and I've heard of James Wren's, charity and certainly a cause I want to learn more about. So I appreciate you, bringing the attention you are to that. I've been asking this question, just given, COVID-19 and different guests have taken it really cool, interesting ways in terms of what they're focusing on out there in the world right now, because that's kind of how I've handled this quarantine. Is I've tried to become really curious about my own process. I've been able to step back from the day-to-day rigors of our NHL season. Have had this established routine of postseason, very similar to, when you're talking about periodization, kind of how I would, scale back the intensity, try and get healthy after a long season, get sleeping good again, ramp it up, chill out preseason. But there's been a little bit of like postseason focus on getting healthy, while also like this reintroduction of, I read Stealing Fire, where I really try to dive into flow state and skill development. So trying to kind of touch base with like rollerblading and some of my outdoor like stick handling work that I used to do as a kid, and that's been a really fun, sort of process. But what in the world right now is kind of lighting you on fire? What's a thought that you continue to revisit right now? What's, a piece of advice you've been using for yourself or for those that, might be looking up to someone, with your mental and physical fortitude? What have you been thinking about a lot lately?
Yeah, I think just from the kind of more macro level, just with all this uncertainty with kind of COVID-19, I think just kind of stepping back a bit and recognizing kind of how good we kind of do have it, especially in developed areas of the world, and that's not always the case in other places. So part of me is trying to appreciate, here we have some limitations where I can't do some of the things I would like to do, but a lot of people on the planet can never do the things that I want to do because they just don't have access to that sort of stuff. They don't have the opportunity to. So kind of trying to reconnect with that a little bit has been, I think, a good practice just in general. And then also kind of forward thinking too, thinking like, well, what can we learn from this to kind of better ourselves down the road, to not only try to help prevent something like this from happening again, but also just be better equipped with being adaptable and being able to kind of respond to uncertainty and not necessarily guarantee like my schedule is this every day and it's going to happen no matter what kind of a mentality, and realize like there's other things and there's other people other than myself that are, important too, and they have their own idea of what they want to be doing or should be doing. So kind of keeping things in perspective with that has been kind of a good practice, I think, for me, given kind of the unfortunate situation that we're in right now.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Zach, I really appreciate, all your time today and just, sharing a lot of what makes you and your sport special. I definitely learned a lot from, your persistence and consistency of mindset and your dedication to process. If people want to find out more about you, they want to learn about, your coaching opportunities. I know you have a podcast as well with Dr. Shawn Baker. How can people go ahead and find more of you?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. And the spot to find me, it's got kind of a link to everything's on my website at zachbitter.com. I'm probably most active on Instagram and Twitter. At Instagram, it's at zachbitter, and Twitter at zbitter. And if you're interested in listening to the podcast or checking it out, it's a Human Performance Outliers podcast.
That's awesome. Zach, thanks, man. What a cool sport, truly. I really appreciate you coming on, and we will release this, I know, in time for your charity run. So
I'll definitely share this one to all my followers and let them know where to find you. And we'll have to get you on our podcast down the road. And
would love to.
And hear your story in a little more detail. I think it'd be fun.
Would love to. So you just let me know. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners right now, wherever you may be in the world. Thank you for your time today. Thank you to our guest, Zach Bitter, truly an exceptional person, an exceptional athlete. I learned a lot about, really myself, and I'm going to try and steal from some of his curiosity around his process and just what a committed individual to being his best at his sport. Truly an exceptional individual. I really appreciate his sense of service, as an athlete, trying to be creative with, like he said, his competitive energy that's pent up in this COVID-19 quarantine time. Instead of doing a small business shout out today, I wanted to talk about the charity that Zach Bitter will be running for on May 16th. He is running 12 consecutive hours, as he mentioned, for the charity Fight for the Forgotten, to build wells in the Congo for the pygmies. It's a charity I'm beginning to learn more about. Truly a noble cause and a tall effort that Zach's going to put up, to try and raise money. So if that's a cause that you can get behind, if you really enjoyed our time today with Zach, a way that you can give back to him and help him serve his mission in the world, check out his charity event, the 12-hour treadmill run, this upcoming May 16th. Again, for all of our listeners, all of your comments, your likes, your subscriptions goes a long way in helping us grow this podcast and helps me grow this platform. It's been a really rewarding, process for me. In the meantime, I'm very excited to see where we can go. Thanks again for sticking with us, and thanks again to our guest, Zach Bitter.